Bullies ripped Shy Girl's backpack. She turned and cracked their noses in one blow. Delilah Voss moved through the crowded hallways of Roosevelt High School like a ghost, her oversized gray hoodie pulled low over her face and her worn black backpack clutched tightly against her chest. At barely 5 feet tall, with pale skin that seemed to bruise if you looked at it wrong, she had learned early that invisibility was her best defense. Her mousy brown hair hung in stringy curtains around her face, and thick-rimmed glasses perched on her nose made her look even smaller than she already was. 3 months into the school year, and she still felt like an outsider in this sprawling brick building that housed nearly 2,000 students. Roosevelt High was one of those massive public schools that seemed designed to swallow kids whole. 3 stories of beige hallways lined with dented lockers, fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead, and the permanent smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with teenage desperation. The building had been constructed in the 1960s and showed every weathered year, from cracked tiles to windows that never quite closed properly. It was the kind of place where you could disappear entirely if you knew how to navigate the right shadows, which was exactly what Delilah had been trying to do since her mother moved them here from Oregon. The morning routine was always the same. Arrive early through the side entrance, slip into first period chemistry before the popular crowd showed up, and try to make it through the day without drawing attention. But attention seemed to find Delilah whether she wanted it or not, especially from Bryce Kellerman and his crew, who had claimed the main hallway as their personal territory. Bryce was everything Delilah wasn't. Tall and confident, with the kind of easy smile that made teachers overlook his mediocre grades and other students gravitate toward him like moths to a flame. His perfectly styled blonde hair probably cost more to maintain than Delilah's entire wardrobe, and his expensive designer clothes marked him as someone who had never wanted for anything. The son of a local real estate mogul, Bryce carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences. Tanner Walsh, his constant shadow, was built like a linebacker with hands the size of dinner plates. He played varsity football and had the kind of reputation that made other students step aside when he walked down the hallway. His loyalty to Bryce was absolute and unquestioning, the kind of devotion that came from finding someone who made him feel important despite his academic struggles. Madison Pike rounded out their unholy trinity with her sharp tongue and cruel sense of humor that could cut someone down to size with surgical precision. She was beautiful in the way that only came from expensive orthodontics and professional highlights, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. The daughter of a prominent local judge, she had learned early that social power was the most valuable currency at Roosevelt High, and she wielded hers like a weapon. Well, what do we have here? Bryce's voice cut through the morning chatter as Delilah tried to navigate past their usual spot near the main staircase. Little Mouse is looking extra ratty today. Delilah kept her eyes down, quickening her pace as her heart began its familiar racing pattern. The main hallway was always the most dangerous part of her day. Too many students, too much attention, too many opportunities for humiliation. "I'm talking to you, freak," Bryce continued, his voice carrying that particular tone of entitled amusement that made Delilah's stomach churn. "Didn't your parents teach you it's rude not to answer when someone's being friendly?" Tanner stepped sideways to block her path, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow her whole. The hallway seemed to narrow around her as other students either pretended not to notice or actively turned to watch the show. Some pulled out their phones, already anticipating something worth recording. "Leave me alone," Delilah mumbled, trying to step around Tanner's bulk, but Madison moved to cut off her escape route. "Oh, it speaks!" Madison laughed, her voice pitched high enough to attract even more attention. "I was starting to think you were mute, though honestly, with a voice like that, maybe you should be." The small crowd that had gathered laughed on cue, feeding off the cruel energy that Bryce and his friends generated. Delilah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she clutched her backpack tighter, feeling the familiar weight of her textbooks and the one thing that truly mattered to her: a worn photo of her father in his boxing gear, taken just before he shipped out for his final deployment. Nobody at Roosevelt knew about Captain James Voss or about the hours Delilah had spent in dingy gyms across 3 different states, learning everything he'd tried to teach her before cancer took him when she was 14. They didn't know about the anger that burned in her chest every time someone pushed her around, or about the voice in her head that sounded like her father, reminding her that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to hit back harder than they hit you. Her father had been a Golden Gloves champion before joining the army, and he'd made sure his daughter knew how to protect herself. But her father's other voice was stronger, the one that told her violence should always be the last resort, that walking away took more strength than fighting back. He'd seen too much violence in his military service to ever glorify it, and he'd taught Delilah that real strength came from choosing your battles wisely. So she swallowed her pride and pushed past them, ignoring Bryce's parting shot about her thrift store clothes and the snickers that followed her down the hallway. The pattern continued for weeks, each incident carefully calibrated to stay just below the radar of administrative intervention. They would find her in the cafeteria during lunch, accidentally bumping into her table and sending her carefully saved lunch money scattering across the sticky floor. They would shoulder-check her in the hallways, sending her books flying while offering exaggerated apologies that fooled nobody but somehow satisfied the teachers who witnessed them. They would make loud comments about her appearance whenever she passed, always just quiet enough that nearby adults could pretend they hadn't heard. Each incident was small enough to seem insignificant on its own, but together they created a constant atmosphere of dread that made Delilah's stomach clench every time she walked through the school doors. She began taking longer routes to avoid their usual haunts, eating lunch in empty classrooms instead of the cafeteria, and timing her bathroom breaks to minimize encounters. It was exhausting, this constant state of hypervigilance, but it was better than the alternative. The one bright spot in her daily nightmare was Jamie Torres, a quiet student in her English class who had started sitting with her at lunch after witnessing one of Bryce's accidental tray knockings. Jamie had warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle smile that seemed to actually see Delilah rather than looking through her. There was something about Jamie's presence that made the worst days bearable, a kindness that didn't come with strings attached. When Jamie read poetry aloud in Mrs. Henderson's English class, Delilah found herself hanging on every word, mesmerized by the way Jamie's voice could make even the driest Shakespeare passage come alive. And when their hands accidentally brushed while passing papers back, she felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with hope. "You don't have to let them treat you like that," Jamie said one afternoon as they sat together in the library, safely hidden among the dusty stacks where Bryce and his friends never ventured. The library was Delilah's sanctuary, a place where Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian, maintained strict silence and had no patience for social games. "It's easier this way," Delilah replied, not looking up from her chemistry homework. "If I ignore them, eventually they'll get bored and move on to someone else." "But what if they don't?" Jamie's voice was soft but insistent. "What if they just keep getting worse?" Delilah didn't answer, but part of her wondered the same thing. The incidents were escalating in both frequency and cruelty. Last week, Tanner had accidentally slammed his locker door on her fingers, leaving them bruised for days. Yesterday, Madison had started a rumor that Delilah didn't shower, leading to exaggerated coughing fits whenever she walked by. And through it all, teachers either didn't notice or actively chose to look the other way, unwilling to challenge students whose parents donated generously to the school's athletic programs. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the autumn air had turned crisp and the trees lining the school's parking lot blazed with orange and gold leaves. She was running late after staying up too late working on a 20-page history paper about the Civil War, and the hallways were already crowded when she arrived. She was hurrying toward her locker when she spotted Bryce, Tanner, and Madison huddled together near the water fountains like conspirators planning a coup. Their heads were bent in whispered conversation, and something about their posture set off alarm bells in her head. There was an anticipatory energy in their stance, the kind of predatory excitement that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Oh, look, it's our favorite little charity case," Bryce called out as she approached, his voice carrying that familiar tone of cruel amusement. "Hey, Delilah, we were just talking about you." She tried to walk faster, but her worn sneakers squeaked against the polished floor, drawing even more attention. A circle was forming around them, other students sensing drama, with the predatory instinct of sharks smelling blood. Phones were already being pulled out, cameras ready to capture whatever humiliation was about to unfold. "We were wondering," Madison chimed in, her voice dripping with false concern, "how someone can afford to go to Roosevelt but can't afford clothes that actually fit. I mean, that hoodie is practically falling apart at the seams. Are you hoping for the homeless chic look, or is that just what poverty looks like? Maybe her mum shops at the Salvation Army," Tanner added with a laugh that sounded like gravel in a blender. "Though even they have standards. I bet they'd reject half the stuff in her closet." Delilah's hands were shaking now, but she forced herself to keep walking, focusing on the worn pattern of tiles beneath her feet. Just get to the locker. Get the books. Get to class. Don't give them the reaction they want. But as she passed their group, trying to make herself as small as possible, she felt a sharp tug on her backpack. The old zipper, already worn thin from years of use, gave way with a sharp, ripping sound that echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. The contents exploded across the polished floor in a cascade of humiliation. Textbooks with carefully wrapped covers, pens held together with tape, loose papers covered in her neat handwriting, and worst of all, the precious photo of her father that she kept tucked in the front pocket like a talisman against the worst the world could throw at her. The photo landed face up on the grimy floor, and Madison's designer boot, probably worth more than everything Delilah owned, came down squarely on top of it before Delilah could react. The sound of the glass frame cracking was like a physical blow, and she felt something break inside her chest that had nothing to do with the damaged picture. "Oops," Madison said, not bothering to hide her smile as she ground her heel into the glass for good measure. "How clumsy of me. Though I guess when you can't afford proper equipment, accidents are bound to happen." The hallway had gone completely silent, except for the sound of Madison's boot on broken glass and the electronic beeping of phone cameras recording every moment of Delilah's degradation. She knelt down slowly, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the pieces of her father's photo, the only physical reminder she had left of the man who had taught her everything about strength and courage. Something inside Delilah snapped in that moment, not broke, but snapped into place like a puzzle piece, finally finding its proper position. The careful control she'd maintained for months, the voice of her father telling her to walk away, the fear that had kept her small and invisible, all of it crumbled in an instant like a dam bursting under pressure. She looked up from the ruined photo to see Bryce's smirking face, and for the first time since starting at Roosevelt, she let him see the fire that had been burning behind her eyes all along. It was the same fire that had driven her father through 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, the same determination that had carried him through cancer treatments, the same strength that had kept Delilah going through everything life had thrown at her. "You're going to pay for that," she said, her voice steady and cold in a way that made several students take an unconscious step backward. There was something in her tone that cut through the morning chatter like a blade, a promise of consequences that made even Tanner's confident smirk falter. Bryce's expression flickered for just a moment before returning to its usual mask of arrogant amusement. Oh, really? And what exactly are you going to do about it, Mouse? Cry at us? Run to the principal like a little baby? Delilah slowly stood up, leaving her scattered belongings on the floor. The circle of students had grown larger, drawn by the electric tension in the air, and she could see phones being held up to record what everyone assumed would be her final humiliation. In the back of the crowd, she caught sight of Jamie's worried face, and something about that look of genuine concern made her decision final. "I'm going to teach you what happens when you mess with the wrong person," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. The words seemed to echo despite being barely above a whisper, and she could see confusion flickering across the faces of students who had only ever known her as the quiet girl who took abuse without fighting back. Bryce looked around at his friends and the crowd, clearly enjoying the attention. "This should be good," he said, cracking his knuckles theatrically. "Come on then, show us what you've got. But make it quick. Some of us have actual important things to do today." What happened next would be talked about at Roosevelt High for years to come, passed down through graduating classes like legend. Delilah moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone who had spent months appearing clumsy and awkward, her body finally allowed to express the years of training that had been hidden beneath oversized clothes. Her first punch caught Bryce square in the nose with a wet crack that sent blood spattering across Madison's pristine white sweater and the faces of nearby students. The blow was perfectly placed, delivered with the kind of precision that only came from countless hours of practice, and Bryce's head snapped back so hard that several people in the crowd actually gasped out loud. Before he could even register what had happened, before his brain could process that mousy little Delilah Voss had just broken his nose with a single punch, her elbow was driving into Tanner's solar plexus with the force of a sledgehammer. The big football player doubled over like a deflated balloon, all the air rushing out of his lungs as he crashed into the water fountain hard enough to crack the porcelain. Madison opened her mouth to scream, probably for help, or maybe just from shock. But Delilah's backhand across her cheek sent her stumbling backward into a group of stunned onlookers who scattered like bowling pins. The slap wasn't meant to cause serious damage, just enough to remind Madison that actions had consequences. The entire exchange lasted less than 10 seconds, a masterclass in controlled violence that left all three bullies on the ground while Delilah stood over them, breathing hard but completely in control. Her father's training had taken over, muscle memory guiding her through combinations she'd practiced 10,000 times, but it was her own moral compass that kept her from going too far. "The next time you want to pick on someone," she said, loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear and record, "remember that you never know who you're messing with. You never know what someone has been through, what they've lost, or what they're capable of when you push them too far." Bryce was holding his broken nose with both hands, blood streaming between his fingers and dripping onto his expensive shirt. His eyes were wide with shock and something that might have been fear, the first real emotion she'd ever seen from him that wasn't cruel amusement or arrogant disdain. Tanner was still struggling to breathe, his face turning purple as he clutched his stomach, while Madison sat on the floor, crying black mascara tears and clutching her reddening cheek. The crowd was dead silent, phones still recording, but no one quite believing what they had just witnessed. This wasn't supposed to happen in their carefully ordered social hierarchy. Victims stayed victims, bullies stayed in power, and the natural order remained undisturbed. But Delilah had just shattered that illusion with 3 perfectly placed strikes. She knelt down carefully and picked up the pieces of her father's photo, her hands gentle despite what they had just done. The glass was cracked in a spiderweb pattern, but the image underneath was still intact, a young soldier in boxing gloves, grinning at the camera with the same determined expression his daughter had worn moments before. "I could have done worse," she said, looking directly at Bryce as he tried to stem the flow of blood. "I could have kept going until you couldn't get up, but I'm not like you. I don't hurt people just because I can. I don't take pleasure in making others suffer. This was about stopping you, not destroying you. She gathered her scattered belongings and stuffed them into her torn backpack, then walked through the parted crowd toward her locker as if nothing unusual had happened. Behind her, she could hear Bryce trying to explain to his friends what had just occurred, his voice thick with blood and confusion. The rest of the day passed in a surreal blur of whispered conversations and sidelong glances. Teachers who had ignored months of systematic bullying suddenly seemed very interested in checking on Delilah's well-being, asking if she needed to talk to a counselor. Students who had never spoken to her before found excuses to walk past her desk, some offering quiet words of support, while others simply stared like she was some kind of fascinating specimen. And through it all, she maintained the same quiet demeanor she'd always had, answering questions politely when asked, but not volunteering information about what had happened or why. It was as if the fight had been a brief eruption from someone who was otherwise perfectly calm and controlled. It was Jamie who finally broke through her composure, finding her after school sitting alone on the metal bleachers overlooking the football field where the varsity team was running practice drills. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the artificial turf. "That was incredible," Jamie said, settling down beside her on the cold metal bench. "I had no idea you could do that. I mean, I knew there was more to you than people realized, but that was like watching someone transform into a completely different person." "My father taught me," Delilah replied, holding up the cracked photo with careful reverence. The glass was broken, but the image was still intact, a young soldier in boxing gloves, grinning at the camera with the same determined expression his daughter had worn that morning. "He looks like he was proud of you," Jamie said softly, studying the image of the man who had shaped so much of Delilah's character. "He always told me that strength isn't about how hard you can hit," Delilah said, her voice thick with emotion she'd been holding back all day. "It's about knowing when to hit and when to walk away. I've been walking away for months, letting them chip away at everything I am. But today," she trailed off, looking out at the empty field. "Today they crossed a line," Jamie finished, understanding flooding their voice, "and you showed them exactly what happens when someone finally fights back. But you didn't become like them. You stopped when you could have kept going." Word of the confrontation spread through Roosevelt like wildfire, growing and changing with each telling until the story had taken on almost mythical proportions. By the next morning, everyone knew that quiet little Delilah Voss had single-handedly taken down the school's most notorious bullies in less time than it took to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Some stories were wildly exaggerated. By Friday, rumors claimed she had put all three of them in the hospital and that she was actually some kind of undercover martial arts expert. But the core truth remained unchanged. The mouse had turned out to be a lion, and Roosevelt High would never be quite the same again. Bryce, Tanner, and Madison returned to school the following week, but they were fundamentally different people. Bryce's nose was taped and slightly crooked, a permanent reminder of what had happened that would affect his appearance for the rest of his life. They no longer held court by the main staircase, no longer commanded the immediate attention of every room they entered. When they passed Delilah in the hallways, they looked straight ahead or found sudden interest in their phones, unwilling to meet her eyes. More importantly, other students throughout the school took notice of the change. Kids who had been targets themselves began standing a little straighter, speaking up a little louder, refusing to accept treatment they had previously endured in silence. The informal code of silence that had protected bullies for years began to crack as teachers found themselves facing students who were no longer afraid to speak up. Roosevelt's social ecosystem, built on fear and intimidation and the unquestioned dominance of those with the most social capital, began to shift towards something resembling actual respect and basic human decency. It wasn't a complete transformation. Institutional change never happens overnight, but it was a beginning, a crack in the foundation that would eventually bring down the whole rotten structure. 3 weeks after the incident, Delilah was surprised to find Bryce waiting by her locker after school, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his hands shoved deep in his pockets. His nose had healed crooked, creating a permanent reminder of their encounter, and there was something different in his eyes, not quite humility, but definitely not the arrogant entitlement she remembered. "I wanted to say something," he began awkwardly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "About what happened, about all of it." Delilah closed her locker and turned to face him, her backpack, now properly repaired with duct tape and determination, slung over one shoulder. She waited patiently for him to find the words he was struggling to form. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words seeming to fight their way out of his mouth. "We were wrong. The way we treated you, the things we said and did. It wasn't okay. I don't even know why we did it, except that it made us feel important somehow. Powerful." "And now?" Delilah asked, her voice neutral but not unkind. "Now I know what it feels like to be on the other side," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "People look at me differently now. They whisper when I walk by. Some of them actually seem afraid of me, but not in the way they used to be. And I realize that's what we did to you every single day for months." Delilah studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but all she saw was a young man who had learned a hard lesson about consequences and the ripple effects of cruelty. There was genuine remorse in his expression, the kind that only came from experiencing real consequences for the first time. "What you did wasn't just wrong," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of months of accumulated pain. "It was cruel. You took someone who was already struggling, already dealing with loss and isolation, and made their life worse because it entertained you. That photo you stepped on? That was my father. He died serving this country, and that picture was all I had left of him." Bryce's face went pale, and she could see the full weight of his actions finally hitting him. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," Delilah interrupted firmly. "None of you cared about who I was or what I might be going through. You just saw someone you thought was weak and decided to make them weaker. You turned my pain into your entertainment." They stood in silence for a moment, the empty hallway echoing around them with the ghosts of all the encounters that had led to this moment of reckoning. "I can't take back what we did," Bryce said eventually, his voice heavy with regret. "But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, really, truly sorry, and it won't happen again. Not to you, not to anyone else." "See that it doesn't," Delilah replied, shouldering her repaired backpack. "Not to me, not to anyone else, because now you know, you never really know who you're messing with. Everyone has a story, everyone has losses, and everyone has a breaking point." As she walked away down the empty hallway, Delilah felt something she hadn't experienced since starting at Roosevelt, genuine peace, not because she had won a fight, but because she had proven to herself that she could stand up to anything and remain true to who she was at her core. She hadn't become a bully in return, hadn't let anger transform her into the thing she hated most. She had simply shown that quiet strength, properly channeled, could be more powerful than loud intimidation. Jamie was waiting for her by the school's main entrance, backpack slung over one shoulder and a genuine smile lighting up their face like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Ready to get out of here?" Jamie asked, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the parking lot where her mother would be waiting. "More than ready," Delilah replied, and for the first time in months she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. Not because she had made herself small enough to be ignored, but because she had proven she was strong enough to stand tall when it mattered most. As they walked out together into the afternoon sunshine, Delilah thought about her father's photo, now carefully taped back together and tucked safely in her repaired backpack. The cracks in the glass caught the light like a spider web, but the image underneath remained clear and strong, just like her resolve to never again let anyone make her feel small or powerless. Roosevelt High had learned an important lesson that day. The quietest person in the room might just be the most dangerous, and true strength isn't about picking on those weaker than you. It's about protecting them from those who would do harm. And sometimes, just sometimes, when all other options have been exhausted and the line has been crossed one too many times, the mouse reveals that it was actually a lion who was simply choosing not to roar, until someone gave them a very good reason to.